Have you ever wondered what secrets children might know that adults prefer to remain hidden? What if a young boy could reveal the darkest truths about people he had never met? This is the story of a photograph that captured something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. A boy whose knowledge defied every law of nature and reason. What you're about to hear challenges everything we understand about the human mind. In the autumn of 1871, a single photograph was taken at one of America's most notorious psychiatric institutions. The subject was a child who possessed knowledge that should have been impossible for anyone to know, let alone a boy barely old enough to read. His case became one of the most documented and terrifying mysteries in medical history. But before we dive into this extraordinary tale, let me warn you. What happened to this child questions the very foundations of reality itself. This story takes place during one of the darkest periods in American medical history. The Civil War had ended just 6 years earlier, leaving the nation scarred and struggling to rebuild. Cities like Boston were flooded with immigrants seeking new opportunities, but life was harsh and unforgiving. Mental health treatment was primitive at best, barbaric at worst. Asylums were places where society sent people they couldn't understand or didn't want to deal with. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts stood as a monument to this brutal approach to psychiatric care. Built on land that once housed Salem farms, the institution carried the weight of America's dark history. Its Gothic towers and endless corridors had witnessed treatments that would horrify us today. Cold water baths that lasted for hours, physical restraints that left permanent marks, and experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. It was into this world that our story's protagonist would eventually find himself. But his journey began in the crowded streets of Boston, in a small apartment where an Irish immigrant family was about to experience something that would shatter their understanding of their own child. The boy's name was Thomas Michael Sullivan. Born on a crisp morning in March 1862 to Patrick and Bridget Sullivan, he seemed destined for an ordinary life. His father worked the docks, loading and unloading ships that brought goods from distant lands. His mother took in washing from wealthy families on Beacon Hill, scrubbing clothes until her hands were raw and bleeding. They lived in Boston's North End, where the smell of baking bread mixed with the stench of poverty, and where neighbours looked out for each other because no one else would. For the first 8 years of his life, Thomas was unremarkable in every way. He played with wooden toys his father carved during long winter evenings. He attended St. Mary's Church every Sunday, where he learned his prayers in Latin, despite barely understanding English properly. The parish school teachers described him as a quiet child, neither brilliant nor slow, just another Irish boy trying to make his way in a world that didn't particularly want him. His parents adored him. Patrick would tell anyone who would listen that Thomas was the light of their lives, the reason they had crossed an ocean to start fresh in America. Bridget would hold him close during thunderstorms, whispering old Irish lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Nothing in their simple, hard-working lives suggested the horror that was approaching. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October 1870. Thomas woke up different, not in any way his parents could immediately identify, but something fundamental had shifted during the night. He came downstairs for breakfast, moving with a strange deliberation, as if each step required careful thought. When Bridget greeted him with her usual cheerful good morning, he simply stared at her with an expression she would later describe as ancient. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came during their morning meal. Thomas, who had always been a chattering child, sat in complete silence, but when he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through the small kitchen. He looked directly at his father and said, "The ship that comes in today carries more than cargo, doesn't it, Da? The man with the gold teeth won't be paying his debts much longer." Patrick nearly choked on his porridge. There was indeed a ship expected that day, and yes, there was a man with gold teeth who owed money to dangerous people. But how could Thomas possibly know about any of this? Patrick had never discussed his work at home, especially not the darker aspects of dock life that involved smuggling and debt collection. Over the following days, Thomas's impossible knowledge expanded in ways that terrified his parents. He began mentioning things about their neighbours that no child should know, private conversations between husbands and wives, secret financial troubles, hidden affairs that the entire neighbourhood whispered about but never spoke of openly. When Mrs. O'Malley from upstairs came down to borrow sugar, Thomas looked at her with those strange, knowing eyes and said, "Your husband's letters from the war aren't the only ones you keep hidden, are they?" Mrs. O'Malley went white as a sheet and fled back to her apartment. Later, Bridget discovered that the woman had indeed been hiding love letters from another man, correspondence that could have destroyed her marriage if discovered. But how could an 8-year-old boy possibly know about such things? The knowledge wasn't limited to neighbourhood gossip. Thomas began displaying familiarity with historical events he had never been taught. He spoke about battles from the Revolutionary War as if he had witnessed them personally. He quoted from books he had never read, in languages he had never studied. When Father McKenna visited their home, Thomas shocked him by reciting passages from obscure theological texts in perfect Latin, discussing complex religious concepts that would challenge seminary students. But perhaps most disturbing was Thomas's knowledge about people's deepest secrets and future events. He would look at visitors to their home and casually mention things about their past that no one else knew. He predicted the death of Mr. Flanagan from the butcher shop 3 days before the man collapsed from a heart attack. He knew that Mrs. Kelly's missing son was hiding in Chicago before anyone had received word of his whereabouts. As weeks turned into months, Thomas's behaviour became increasingly unsettling. His voice began to change, sometimes taking on qualities that seemed far too mature for a child. He would stand motionless for hours, staring at walls as if seeing through them to something beyond. His eyes, once bright and innocent, developed a disturbing intensity that made adults uncomfortable. Neighbours began crossing the street to avoid him. The breaking point came on a bitter February night in 1871. Patrick woke to find Thomas standing in their small kitchen, perfectly still, wearing only his nightclothes, despite the freezing temperature. When Patrick approached, Thomas turned to him with eyes that seemed completely black in the dim light. In a voice that echoed strangely in the small room, he said, "The fire will start in the baker's shop tomorrow at precisely 3 p.m. 7 people will die, but not the ones you think. The real tragedy isn't the deaths, Father. It's what the survivors will do afterward." The next day, exactly as Thomas had predicted, a fire broke out at Donnelly's bakery at 3 o'clock. 7 people died in the blaze, and the aftermath revealed a web of insurance fraud and arson that destroyed several families in the neighbourhood. Patrick and Bridget realised they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. Desperate for help, they turned first to their church. Father McKenna, who had known Thomas since his baptism, initially dismissed their concerns as parental anxiety, but when he met with the boy privately, his perspective changed dramatically. Thomas not only demonstrated knowledge of church matters that would challenge trained theologians, but he also revealed intimate details about the priest's own past that he had never shared with anyone. The priest attempted what he called a blessing, but Thomas responded in ways that defied explanation. He recited the prayers along with Father McKenna, but in reverse order, as if he knew exactly what was coming next. When the priest tried to place holy water on Thomas's forehead, the child smiled coldly and said, "That won't work, Father." We both know what I am now. Convinced that traditional religious intervention had failed, the Sullivan family sought medical help. Dr. William Crawford, one of Boston's few specialists in mental disorders, agreed to examine Thomas. Dr. Crawford had studied in Europe and considered himself well versed in the latest psychiatric techniques. He expected to find a case of childhood hysteria or perhaps some form of developmental disorder. His expectations crumbled during his first session, not only impossible knowledge, but also an ability with Thomas. the boy demonstrate to manipulate the conversation in ways that left the doctor deeply unsettled. Thomas knew details about Dr. Crawford's medical training, his family history, and even his private fears about his professional competence. More disturbing still, Thomas seemed to take pleasure in revealing these secrets. Watching the doctor's discomfort with obvious satisfaction, Dr. Crawford's detailed notes, which survive to this day, describe phenomena that challenged every medical theory of the time. Thomas's body temperature was consistently lower than normal. Plants in the doctor's office began to wither when Thomas was present for extended periods. Most unnervingly, Dr. Crawford reported feeling physically drained after each session, as if something was drawing energy from him. The final incident that led to Thomas's institutionalization occurred on a March evening in 1871. Neighbours reported hearing strange sounds coming from the Sullivan apartment, voices that seemed too numerous for the 3 family members who lived there. When Patrick went to check on his son, he found Thomas sitting in the centre of his small bedroom, surrounded by what appeared to be shadows that moved independently of any light source. Thomas looked up at his father with those disturbing black eyes and spoke in multiple voices simultaneously, creating an impossible harmony that made Patrick's head spin. The voices spoke in languages Patrick didn't recognise, but somehow he understood their meaning. They spoke of things that had happened long before Thomas was born, and things that would happen long after everyone in the room was dead. That night, Patrick and Bridget made the most difficult decision of their lives. Their son, the child they loved more than life itself, would have to be committed to Danvers State Hospital. They had exhausted every other option. The church couldn't help them. Medicine couldn't explain what was happening. Thomas was becoming something they could no longer recognise, and they feared for their own safety as much as his. The journey to Danvers would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Thomas's story, one that would be documented in unprecedented detail by the hospital's medical staff. But it would also mark the end of his childhood and the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases in psychiatric history. As we continue this tale, remember that every detail I'm sharing with you has been meticulously documented by medical professionals of the time. This isn't folklore or legend. This is a case that challenged the very foundations of 19th century medicine and continues to puzzle researchers today. The admission process at Danvers State Hospital was designed to strip away whatever remained of a patient's former identity. On the morning of March 20th, 1871, Thomas Sullivan was brought through the imposing iron gates of the institution, carried in a horse-drawn wagon that had transported countless other souls into this realm of forgotten humanity. His parents had made the journey with him, but they were not permitted beyond the main entrance. The final image they had of their son was his small figure disappearing through massive wooden doors that seemed to swallow him whole. Dr. Elias Hartwell, the hospital's chief physician, had built his reputation on his methodical approach to documenting unusual psychiatric cases. A graduate of Harvard Medical School, who had spent 2 years studying under pioneering alienists in Paris, he prided himself on maintaining scientific objectivity even when confronted with the most bizarre manifestations of mental distress. When Thomas was brought to his office for the mandatory intake examination, Hartwell expected to encounter another case of childhood dementia, or perhaps an exceptionally severe form of hysteria. The moment Thomas entered the office, however, Hartwell knew this case would be different. The boy moved with an unnatural stillness, his eyes scanning the room, not with the curiosity typical of children, but with the calculating assessment of someone far older. Before Hartwell could begin his standard questions, Thomas surprised him by speaking first. "You're wondering about the patient in room 14 who died last Tuesday, aren't you, Doctor?" Thomas said, his voice carrying an odd resonance in the cramped office. "The one whose death you've been trying to understand. Margaret Whitman wasn't supposed to die from her condition. Something else killed her." Hartwell's blood ran cold. Margaret Whitman had indeed died the previous Tuesday, and her death had been puzzling him for days. The woman had been recovering well from what appeared to be a mild case of melancholia when she suddenly expired during the night. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Hartwell had been privately questioning whether something else might have contributed to her unexpected demise. More troubling still, the details of Margaret's case were contained only in confidential medical files that no one outside the hospital staff should have access to. "How do you know about Mrs. Whitman?" Hartwell asked, trying to maintain his professional composure while his mind raced to find a rational explanation. Thomas smiled, but there was nothing childlike about the expression. "I know many things about the people who have passed through these walls, Doctor. Would you like me to tell you about the others? The ones whose deaths you've recorded but never truly understood?" What followed was perhaps the most disturbing medical consultation in Hartwell's distinguished career. Thomas began describing, with precise accuracy, the cases of patients who had died at the hospital over the previous 2 years. He knew not only their names and official causes of death, but intimate details about their final days that were recorded only in Hartwell's private notes. More unnervingly, Thomas provided information about these patients' lives before their admission that wasn't contained in any hospital records. He spoke about Jonathan Pierce, a farmer who had been committed for violent episodes, describing Pierce's childhood trauma of watching his father murder his mother with an axe. Thomas recounted the final words of Sarah Coleman, an elderly woman who had died of consumption, words she had whispered to a nurse in the middle of the night when no one else was present. He even knew about Dr. Hartwell's own doubts regarding certain treatments, fears the doctor had never voiced to anyone, but Thomas's knowledge extended far beyond the confines of the hospital. During that first examination, he demonstrated familiarity with Dr. Hartwell's personal life that should have been impossible for any patient to possess. He mentioned the doctor's wife's struggle with laudanum addiction, a secret Hartwell had managed to keep hidden from even his closest colleagues. He spoke about Hartwell's brother, who had died in the war, describing details of the man's final letter home that only family members had seen. "Your brother didn't die from his wounds, Doctor," Thomas said, his young voice taking on a strange, hollow quality. "He died from what he saw in that field hospital, the things that were done to the wounded Confederate soldiers. The experiments. Your family was told he died heroically, but you've always wondered about the truth, haven't you?" Hartwell's hands began to tremble. His brother's death had indeed haunted him for years, and he had always suspected there was more to the story than the official reports revealed. But how could this child possibly know about such things? The examination continued for over 3 hours, during which Thomas displayed capabilities that defied medical explanation. He wrote fluently in languages he claimed never to have studied, producing text in Latin, Greek, and what appeared to be ancient Hebrew. When Hartwell tested his knowledge by showing him photographs of people he couldn't possibly have met, Thomas provided detailed biographical information about each subject that proved to be completely accurate when later verified. Most disturbing of all was Thomas's ability to predict future events with uncanny precision. During that first session, he told Hartwell that a fire would break out in the hospital's east wing within the week, that it would start in the linen closet on the second floor at approximately 2 p.m, and that while no one would die, the incident would reveal structural problems that would force the closure of an entire ward. 5 days later, everything happened exactly as Thomas had predicted. Dr. Hartwell began documenting Thomas's case with obsessive detail, recognizing that he was dealing with phenomena that challenged the very foundations of medical science. His daily notes describe a child who seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple realities, drawing knowledge from sources that couldn't be identified or explained. Thomas spoke of historical events as if he had witnessed them personally, described the private thoughts of people he had never met, and demonstrated understanding of complex scientific and philosophical concepts that would challenge university professors. The other patients at Danvers began to react strangely to Thomas's presence. Within days of his arrival, several long-term residents who had been considered stable cases began exhibiting new and disturbing behaviours. They spoke of seeing figures that weren't there, hearing voices that seemed to come from empty rooms, and experiencing vivid dreams about events from Thomas's life that they couldn't possibly have known about. A young woman named Elizabeth Harper, who'd been admitted for episodes of hysteria following the death of her infant son, began speaking obsessively about Thomas's childhood in Boston. She described the Sullivan family's apartment in precise detail, recounted conversations between Thomas and his parents, and even sang Irish lullabies that Bridget Sullivan had sung to her son. When questioned about how she knew these things, Elizabeth could only say that the boy had shown her these memories in her dreams. The influence Thomas exerted over other patients wasn't limited to sharing impossible knowledge. Staff members began reporting that patients would move through the hospital corridors in strange formations, as if following invisible instructions. During mealtimes, they would arrange themselves in specific geometric patterns that seemed to centre around wherever Thomas was sitting. Some patients began speaking in unison, reciting words in languages none of them had ever studied. Dr. Hartwell realised that Thomas represented not just an individual case study, but a phenomenon that was affecting the entire institution. The boy's presence seemed to act as a catalyst, awakening dormant capabilities in other patients, or perhaps revealing aspects of human consciousness that were normally hidden. Whatever was happening at Danvers went far beyond conventional psychiatric disorders. After 6 weeks of careful observation, Hartwell made the difficult decision to isolate Thomas from the general patient population. The boy was moved to a private room on the 3rd floor of the hospital's east wing, away from the main wards. The room was sparse, containing only basic furnishings and a single barred window that looked out over the Massachusetts countryside. But even in isolation, Thomas's influence continued to manifest throughout the hospital. Nurses reported feeling inexplicably drained after spending time near Thomas's room. Several requested transfers to other wards, claiming they experienced severe headaches and disturbing dreams whenever they worked in his section. The temperature in the corridor outside his room remained consistently lower than the rest of the building, despite all attempts to regulate the heating system. Plants placed near Thomas's window would wither and die within days regardless of care. Even more strangely, several staff members reported seeing shadows moving in their peripheral vision when Thomas was present, shapes that seemed to exist independently of any light source. During the night hours, guards walking past his room could hear what sounded like multiple voices engaged in conversation, though Thomas was supposedly alone. The isolation period marked the beginning of a more intensive phase of study. Dr. Hartwell implemented a series of experiments designed to understand the nature of Thomas's extraordinary capabilities. He subjected the boy to tests that pushed the boundaries of ethical medical practice, driven by a scientific obsession that was slowly consuming his rational judgment. Thomas submitted to these experiments with an unsettling compliance, as if he understood their purpose better than the doctor conducting them. He seemed to anticipate each test before it was administered, sometimes providing answers to questions before they were asked. During sessions designed to measure his memory, Thomas would recall not only information he had been given, but also details about the lives of the researchers that they had never shared with anyone. The boy's physical condition began to deteriorate during this period, though not in ways that followed recognizable medical patterns. He lost weight despite maintaining what appeared to be a normal appetite. His skin became pale and almost translucent, with veins becoming clearly visible beneath the surface. His hair darkened from its original brown to an almost black colour, and his eyes seemed to grow larger and more prominent in his increasingly gaunt face. More disturbing were the periods of complete physical rigidity that Thomas began experiencing. During these episodes, he would remain motionless for hours at a time, his body becoming statue-like, while his eyes remained open and alert. His breathing and pulse continued normally, but he would not respond to any external stimulus. Dr. Hartwell discovered that these periods of rigidity coincided with the most intense supernatural manifestations throughout the hospital. During one particularly memorable episode in late May 1871, Thomas entered a state of rigidity that lasted for 18 hours. Throughout this period, staff members reported unprecedented disturbances across the entire institution. Doors slammed shut without anyone touching them. Windows rattled despite the absence of wind. Patients in distant wards woke up screaming about visions they couldn't explain. When Thomas finally emerged from the rigid state, he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously. "The convergence is approaching," he said, his words creating an impossible harmony that made listeners feel dizzy. "What you see in me is merely the beginning. There are others like me awakening across the world, children who carry knowledge that was never meant to exist in mortal minds. We are harbingers of something far greater than your limited understanding can comprehend." Dr. Hartwell documented every word, every phenomenon, every impossible manifestation that occurred in Thomas's presence. His notes from this period reveal a man increasingly consumed by obsession, driven to understand something that might be fundamentally beyond human comprehension. He had devoted his career to the rational study of mental disorders, but Thomas Sullivan was forcing him to confront possibilities that existed far outside the realm of conventional science. As spring turned to summer in 1871, it became clear that Thomas's case was unlike anything in medical literature. The boy who had once been a normal child living in Boston's North End had become something that challenged the very nature of reality itself, and Dr. Hartwell was about to make a decision that would forever change our understanding of what had been captured in the walls of Danvers State Hospital. The decision that would forever alter the trajectory of Thomas Sullivan's case came to Dr. Hartwell during a sleepless night in early June 1871. For weeks he had been struggling with a phenomenon that defied every principle of his medical training. Thomas seemed to appear differently to different observers, as if his very essence shifted depending on who was looking at him. Some staff members described him as a pale but otherwise normal child. Others saw something in his appearance that filled them with inexplicable dread, reporting features that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Hartwell himself had experienced this perceptual instability. During morning examinations, Thomas would appear as what he was, a 9-year-old boy, albeit one with unusual intelligence and disturbing knowledge. But during the evening sessions, particularly when Thomas entered his states of rigidity, there was something about his appearance that suggested he was far older and infinitely more dangerous than any human child should be. The doctor hoped that photography might provide objective documentation of Thomas's true appearance. Medical photography was still a relatively new field, but several pioneering institutions were beginning to use it for documenting psychiatric cases. Hartwell contacted Marcus Whitmore, a photographer who specialized in medical portraits and had worked with various Boston hospitals. Whitmore had a reputation for discretion and technical precision, qualities essential for documenting sensitive psychiatric cases. When Hartwell explained the nature of the case, Whitmore initially expressed scientific curiosity about the challenge. He had photographed hundreds of patients throughout his career and considered himself prepared for any unusual circumstances. The photographer agreed to conduct the session using specialized equipment that would capture the finest details of the subject's appearance. The photographic session was scheduled for the morning of June 18th, 1871, almost exactly 3 months after Thomas's admission to Danvers. Whitmore arrived at the hospital before dawn, bringing his heavy camera equipment, glass plates for image capture, and the chemical apparatus necessary for on-site development. He had specifically chosen early morning hours because natural light would be at its most favourable for the type of detailed portrait Hartwell required. When Whitmore was escorted to Thomas's isolation room, he immediately noticed something unusual about the quality of light. Despite the early hour and clear weather outside, the room seemed shrouded in a subtle darkness that appeared to concentrate around Thomas himself. The boy sat motionless in his chair, wearing the standard grey hospital uniform, watching Whitmore arrange his equipment with an intensity that made the photographer increasingly uncomfortable. Throughout the 30-minute preparation period, Thomas remained completely silent. But Whitmore later noted in his professional journal that the child seemed to understand the photographic process intuitively, positioning himself correctly before being given any instructions. When Whitmore finally adjusted his camera for the exposure, he felt an overwhelming sensation of being observed not just by Thomas, but by something much larger that was somehow connected to the boy. The moment Whitmore instructed Thomas to look directly into the camera lens, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The temperature dropped so suddenly that both men could see their breath in the previously warm space. Whitmore felt a physical sensation he would later describe as something invisible passing through his entire body, leaving him momentarily dizzy and disoriented. Despite these disturbing sensations, Whitmore completed the exposure, holding the shutter open for the 15 seconds required by the photographic technology of the era. During those 15 seconds, he maintained eye contact with Thomas and experienced what he called a profound sense of displacement, as if he were simultaneously photographing the boy and being photographed by him. Immediately after completing the exposure, Whitmore retreated to an adjacent room to develop the glass plate using his portable laboratory setup. The development process required careful manipulation of dangerous chemicals and precise timing, procedures Whitmore had performed thousands of times throughout his career. But from the moment he began processing Thomas's photograph, he knew something was fundamentally wrong. The chemicals reacted in ways he had never seen before, creating patterns and textures that defied his decades of experience. Some areas of the image developed with unusual rapidity, while others remained stubbornly dark, creating an irregular emergence of the picture that seemed to follow no logical pattern. When the photograph was finally complete, both Whitmore and Dr. Hartwell stared at the result in stunned silence. The image that emerged from the glass plate was simultaneously exactly what they had expected and completely different from anything either man had ever seen. Thomas appeared in the photograph seated in the precise position where he had been during the session, wearing the same clothes in the same room. Every physical detail was present and accurate according to their observations, but there was something in the image that transcended normal photography. Thomas's eyes in the picture seemed to be looking directly at whoever viewed the photograph, regardless of the angle from which it was observed. More unnervingly, his eyes appeared to have impossible depth, as if the camera had captured not just their surface appearance, but infinite layers of consciousness behind them. The boy's expression in the photograph was subtly different from what both men remembered from the actual session. It wasn't drastically altered, but something in his face suggested knowledge and experience that belonged to someone far older. Observers who looked at the photograph for extended periods reported feeling as though they might lose themselves in those strange, penetrating eyes. As Whitmore and Hartwell examined the image more closely, they began noticing details that shouldn't have been present. Shadows appeared in the photograph that didn't correspond to the lighting conditions during the actual session. At the edges of the image, vague shapes seemed to move when observed peripherally, as if other presences had been captured alongside Thomas. The photograph quickly became a subject of intense debate among the medical staff at Danvers. Dr. Hartwell convened emergency meetings with the hospital's senior physicians to examine the image and discuss its implications. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the institution's second most experienced alienist, initially suggested that the anomalies were the result of technical problems with the photographic equipment or chemical processing. This theory was immediately challenged when Whitmore returned to the hospital to take control photographs using identical equipment, chemicals, and even the same room. The control images developed normally, showing none of the strange qualities present in Thomas's portrait. Whatever had affected the original photograph was specifically connected to the boy himself, not to any technical malfunction. Dr. Rebecca Ashford, one of the few female physicians working in psychiatric medicine at the time, proposed a more radical explanation. She suggested that Thomas might be suffering from an unknown neurological condition that affected not only his mental state, but also his physical interaction with the environment around him. Ashford had read European case studies of patients who allegedly demonstrated psychokinetic abilities during severe psychiatric episodes. This theory gained credibility when the medical staff systematically reviewed all documented phenomena associated with Thomas's presence. The temperature fluctuations, the effects on plants and other patients, the movement of objects without physical contact, all could theoretically be explained by some form of anomalous bioelectric field generated by an unprecedented neurological disorder. Dr. Hartwell, while intrigued by Ashford's hypothesis, maintained his scientific skepticism. He proposed conducting a series of controlled experiments to test whether Thomas might be producing measurable physical energy. These experiments would involve precise monitoring of electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and even attempts to photograph supposed energy emanations using experimental techniques. The medical debate intensified when copies of Thomas's photograph were sent to specialists in Boston, New York, and even prominent European researchers who were pioneering new approaches to psychiatric medicine. The responses were universally disturbing. Every consulted expert agreed that the image contained anomalies they had never encountered in decades of working with medical photography. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a renowned German psychiatrist famous for his studies of hysteria and dissociation, wrote a detailed analysis after examining the photograph. He theorized that Thomas might be experiencing an extreme form of multiple personality disorder, where different personalities not only coexisted within his mind, but somehow affected his physical appearance in ways detectable by photographic equipment, but invisible to direct human observation. Following the June photography session, Thomas's condition began deteriorating with alarming speed. The process of being photographed seemed to have catalyzed changes in both his physical and mental state that surprised even Dr. Hartwell, who had been documenting the boy's gradual decline for months. Thomas began spending increasingly longer periods in catatonic states. These episodes, which had previously lasted several hours, now extended for days at a time. During these periods, he remained completely motionless, unresponsive to external stimuli, yet clearly aware of everything happening around him. His eyes would track movement and focus on specific individuals, but he showed no voluntary physical response to any attempt at communication. More disturbing still, the supernatural phenomena throughout Danvers Hospital intensified dramatically during Thomas's prolonged catatonic episodes. His room temperature would drop to levels that formed ice on the windows, even during the hottest summer days. Objects moved with greater violence and frequency, sometimes being hurled across rooms with enough force to crack walls and shatter furniture. Medical staff members began reporting increasingly severe physical and psychological effects when working near Thomas's section of the hospital. Nurses complained of debilitating headaches that would begin the moment they entered his corridor and persist for hours after leaving. Several experienced vivid nightmares, filled with images and voices they couldn't identify, but somehow knew were connected to the boy's presence. In August 1871, Sister Catherine Murphy, who had worked courageously with Thomas for months despite the mounting strangeness surrounding his case, requested immediate transfer to another institution. In her official request, she wrote words that would haunt Dr. Hartwell for the rest of his career. Whatever is manifesting through that child is spreading beyond the confines of his room. I fear we are witnessing something that threatens not just our patients, but our very souls. Thomas's physical appearance continued its alarming transformation throughout the summer months. His weight loss accelerated to the point where he appeared almost skeletal, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to be consuming itself. His skin became so pale it was nearly translucent, revealing a network of dark veins that pulsed within rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. Most disturbing was the change in his hair, which had darkened to an absolute black and began growing at an unnatural rate. Within weeks it reached lengths that should have taken months to achieve, hanging around his shoulders in thick strands that seemed to move independently of any air current in his room. In September 1871, Thomas entered what would become his final catatonic state. He remained motionless for 6 consecutive weeks, neither eating nor drinking, yet somehow maintaining basic biological functions through means that Dr. Hartwell could not begin to explain. Medical science dictated that he should have died from dehydration within days, but Thomas continued to live, his body sustained by forces that operated outside the laws of physiology. During these final weeks, Thomas's eyes remained open and alert, occasionally focusing with laser-like intensity on empty corners of his room, as if observing things that were invisible to everyone else. Sometimes his lips would move slightly, forming words that produced no sound, as if he were engaged in silent conversations with unseen entities. The phenomena surrounding Thomas reached their peak during this period. Temperature fluctuations became so extreme that ice would form on surfaces throughout the entire 3rd floor. Objects moved, not just in his room, but throughout the hospital, creating an atmosphere of constant unease among patients and staff alike. Several long-term residents began speaking in languages they had never learned, reciting what appeared to be ancient texts in perfect pronunciation. Dr. Hartwell documented every detail with obsessive precision, recognizing that he was witnessing something that would either revolutionize medical understanding or challenge the very foundations of scientific reality. His notes from this period reveal a man pushed to the edge of his intellectual capacity, struggling to maintain rational analysis while confronted with phenomena that seemed to exist beyond the reach of human comprehension. As October approached, it became clear that Thomas Sullivan's extraordinary case was reaching some form of climax. The boy who had once played in the streets of Boston's North End had become something that transcended normal categories of human experience, and the photograph that captured his image would soon become one of the most studied and debated documents in the history of medicine. Thomas Michael Sullivan died on the morning of November 7th, 1871, at 9 years old. Dr. Hartwell was present and noted that his death came with an eerie tranquility that defied the months of supernatural chaos that had surrounded the boy. Thomas simply closed his eyes during one of the rare moments when the phenomena in his room had ceased and stopped breathing. At the exact instant of his death, the temperature throughout the 3rd floor returned to normal for the first time in weeks. The photograph of Thomas Sullivan became one of the most analysed and debated medical documents of the 19th century. Copies were distributed to universities and research institutions across America and Europe, where specialists spent decades attempting to explain its impossible qualities. Various theories emerged, from technical anomalies to revolutionary concepts about human consciousness, but none could fully account for why the image affected everyone who viewed it so profoundly. Dr. Hartwell continued studying Thomas's case for the remainder of his career, publishing detailed monographs that became required reading in psychiatric circles worldwide. His meticulous documentation established new standards for investigating anomalous medical cases, influencing how researchers approach phenomena that challenge conventional understanding. More than 150 years later, Thomas Sullivan's case continues to fascinate scientists, historians, and anyone who dares to question the boundaries of human experience. His story reminds us that reality may be far more complex and mysterious than our current knowledge can explain. Some secrets, it seems, are meant to challenge everything we think we know about the nature of consciousness itself. The boy who spoke secrets no one should know left behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be.